Hello again, everyone. My name is David Buckley, and I'm the Paul Weber Endowed Chair in Politics, Science, and Religion here at the University of Louisville. I'm also interim director of the Center for Asian Democracy here at U of L, which is hosting this series that you have been tuning into this week. CAD is glad to be sponsoring the 2022 meeting of the Southeast Conference of the Association for Asian Studies, which is taking place here in Louisville, starting today, actually on Friday when we're recording this, and going on this weekend here in mid-January. We've been speaking this week with some of the presenters at the conference whose research touches on topics of democratization in the region. And so last, but certainly not least in this series of conversations, we're excited to have Johnny Bassett join us. We'll be talking today about his research into a city and a country that's very important to questions of democratization in the region and has an also very important upcoming election, that is the Philippines. Johnny Bassett is a doctoral candidate in history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's a historian of 20th and 21st century Southeast Asia with a focus on economic development in the Philippines. His dissertation in progress explores the recent economic history of Davao City, the largest city on the southern Philippine island of Mindanao. The story of Davao's economic transformation in the 80s, from the 80s up until the present, is one of the most consequential historic narratives in the Philippines, and is closely linked to the successful political campaign of now President Rodrigo Duterte. In addition to his academic research, he is a journalist and has previously served as a documentary filmmaker. First of all, thank you very much, Johnny, for taking the time to join us today in the midst of the early semester rush, and we look forward to your presentation this weekend at the formal conference. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks very much, David. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, so as I said in the intro, your doctoral research is focused on political economy in Davao City in the Philippines. As we noted already, Davao is sort of famous within the country and even internationally, for those who know, for the tremendous economic change that has taken place there in just the past few decades. Could you start out maybe just by giving us a quick overview of what that change looks like on the ground in the lived reality of people in Davao?
Yeah, so I'll tell you the narrative of Davao City as people know it now. So in the 70s and 80s, Davao was one of the most violent cities in the country. And that was because at that time there was a communist insurgent still running communist insurgency, but it was the communist revolution was particularly hot in Mindanao and nowhere hotter than in Davao City. So by the early 80s, the NPA had established some strong footholds in the city. And once anti-communist movements had sprung up as well, like Alsamasa or the Tad-Tuds, which you may have heard of, there was a lot of violence in the city. So as an example, in 1984, there were more than 800 murders in the city that year alone, including more than 150 police officers, many of whom were killed in broad daylight and on busy city thoroughfares. So that's how people think of Davao in the 80s. It was known as Murder City, and it was thought of as a violent economic backwater. If you flash forward to today, it's a totally different city. It's safe. It is regarded as safe and prosperous, and the economy in Davao City and the Davao region is one of the most dynamic in the Philippines. So how did that change happen? Well, if you talk to President Rodrigo Duterte, who was the mayor in Davao from the late 80s on and off until he ran for president in 2016, there's a pretty clear narrative for how it changed, and he is largely responsible for that change. So by telling people that the unconventional methods that he used to develop the city, he could then apply to the whole country, that was a very, very compelling narrative for Filipino voters in 2016, as evidenced by their votes. Duterte won in a relative landslide in 2016, and it was based largely on his promise to apply the model of Davao City to the entire country.
Yeah, great, thanks. So can you tell us a little bit about what that model actually looks like in practice and how Duterte has moved that to the national level? So he's obviously a complicated figure, widely popular, not just in that initial election, but continuing to be in surveys as far as we have survey-based evidence. while also, of course, attracting extensive criticisms from some quarters for alleged human rights violations. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what this Duterte approach in Davao looked like, and what aspects of that, both politically and economically, have actually been transported to the national stage?
Mhm. So I'll tell you first that this remains an open question. There is quite limited understanding of what actually went on in Davao during this time, which is the basis of my dissertation. But I'll tell you how Duterte reports what he did, and then what we know from some of the reporting that's already been done. So the reason why Duterte was getting so many headlines in the West when he was running for president in 2016 is that he had a pretty glib and sensational version for what he had done as mayor. And that was that he had essentially, he had used violence to clear out all of the undesirable elements in the city, basically. And so he was making headlines for saying things that like, I'll make the fish in Manila Bay fat with all the bodies, and making allusions to the murders that he may or may not have committed in Davao, the murders that have been widely attributed to him or the people that work for him. So this is why he was getting headlines, because he was saying that all of this violence had led directly to economic recovery. Of course, if you think about it, at all, you would start to wonder what that causal connection was. And so some people have looked more specifically into what policies may have helped close that gap there. And so some of the things that we do know from Davao, from looking at some of the newspaper reporting at the time, and there's very limited scholarly analysis of economic development in Davao, but the consistent note is that there were very aggressive investment incentive policies in the mid-90s in Davao City, far above what was going on at a national level. So as you may know, in the early 90s, there was a big push nationally to energize the Philippine economy because it had really cratered out in the mid-80s. And the Aquino and Ramos administrations were dead set on getting the economy going again. So they offered lots of incentives to investors to bring their money into the Philippines. And that meant that all of these cities were competing. They all had the benefit of these incentives, but the cities were still competing against each other to attract that value. And what Davao did was the Davao City government introduced a new set of incentives that went far above and beyond the incentives offered by any other city in the country to entice investment to come in. And what we know from what I found out from looking at some of the newspapers was that they were quite successful in that although at first they started out just bringing in local investors, they got a lot of money in really quickly and were able to put that into some local industries, try a lot of different things. Some of them didn't work at all. But over about 5 or 10 years, that stream of money that was coming in helped to re-energize the economy. So that leaves a lot of questions unanswered. But we know that those policies played a big role, and we know that it probably wasn't as simple as the story that Duterte was telling to get a laugh, to get attention, to sell himself during the 2016 election. There's something else going on, probably, and that's what I'm still investigating for my dissertation.
That's great. Yeah, no, it's super important, I think, to think through that causal link in a little more detail than the myth making around national figures might indicate. I mean, I'm curious. I know you're not necessarily researching the national level, but do you have a sense that economic approach, not the security approach, not the human rights issues, but that economic approach is something that he's brought to the national level, or have there been new constraints once he's found himself at the perch of the country as opposed to at the perch of a city?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not enough of an expert on his current policies to be able to make that comparison. But I know that at least at the beginning, there was a lot of talk about how to bring these policies, how to scale up these policies from the city level. And I have not been paying attention in the last 2 years to know how well that's played out. So my apologies about that.
No, well, it's a sign of a good dissertation that you're not getting distracted by by things.
That's a very positive way to spin it. I appreciate that.
That's right. Yeah, we'll forward this to the committee. So, maybe we can wrap up then by sort of asking you that bigger picture question about. So, okay, Davao has this sort of unusual distinction about both being a real economic success, a relatively undisputed economic success in the recent past, along with aspects of political violence and illiberality in local political systems. What do you think this recent history has to teach us about challenges facing liberal democracy in the Philippines, or even more broadly in the coming years?
Yeah, I think that Davao, at a minimum, is a striking counterexample to the orthodoxy that there's a set path to democratization or to economic development, more precisely. So we're hearing more now about there's the rhetorical framing of a Chinese model for development versus an American model for investment, or a Western model for development. One which prioritizes personal liberties, the other which prioritizes the economic rights of citizens. So that debate is still not taken seriously by many people. And I think Davao is an example for why we at a minimum should think more seriously about that debate, and we should take it more seriously, not because for any normative reasons, but because empirically Davao presents a counterexample to the narrative that you need to have liberal and democratic norms in place in order to develop economically. Davao did not have those things. China did not have those things. And yet people really, really like it. In Davao, people really support what Duterte did. And Duterte continues to be incredibly popular at the national level. So at a minimum, we need to understand better why those people feel that way and what the underlying economic history was that produced that political movement that we're seeing today. And unless we really understand those mechanisms and understand how we went from a changing reality on the ground that I started out describing, how we went from that to the political movement that we see today that looks profoundly illiberal and kind of like it's treated more as an aberration from the norm, it is increasingly normal, and we need to understand it better. That's what Davao, I think, teaches us, that it's a wake-up call. We need to take this more seriously and understand it more deeply than we do now.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And a set of questions that, as you indicate, related to China have much broader importance certainly around Southeast Asia, right? But even more broadly, I would say for questions of democratization and liberalism around other parts of Asia, from South Asia to even parts of East Asia. So thanks so much for joining us today to share a little bit about your research. Looking forward to your presentation this weekend. And as somebody with an interest in the Philippines, I'm really looking forward also to seeing how the project develops over the next couple of years. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks very much, David. Good to talk to you.